honor of Florida Arbor Day. So with that, we are going to jump in to learn about Pines of Pinellas, again, in honor of Florida Arbor Day, which is today. It's always celebrated on the third Friday in January. So just quickly, for those of you that might not know me, my name is Lara Milligan. I am the Natural Resources Agent here in Pinellas County. I work for the University of Florida's IFAS Extension, but again, my office is stationed in Pinellas County, so I have countywide responsibility to teach you all about our natural resources and what we can do to protect them, and just fun ways like this that we can learn to appreciate them a little bit more and just be excited when we're out in nature. I did also attend the University of Florida. I got my bachelor's and master's there in forest resources and conservation. So trees are a big part of my life, and I hope to teach you just a small snippet of what I have learned in today's presentation. So quickly, what we're going to go over is what makes a pine a pine. Then kind of the bulk of today's presentation will be in tips for identifying the pine species that we have here in Pinellas County. And then briefly, we'll do a short little activity I'll show you on the value and importance of pines and how you can figure that out for not only pines, but any tree species that you have in your yard or neighborhood. And then, of course, right, you're already here. We're celebrating Florida Arbor Day, but you can continue to do that today and even tomorrow at John Taylor Park. The county is doing a big Arbor Day event tomorrow from 10 to 2, so I will be there if you didn't get enough of me today. So my goal is, based on that you will be able to describe characteristics that make a pine after today, be able to correctly identify the 3 common pine species that we have here in Pinellas. There's only 3, so you can do it. I have faith. And then just to be able to name at least one benefit that trees, pines and or trees in general, provide to us. And I'm going to try and keep it an eye on the chat. It's on another screen on my end. But if you guys have questions throughout today's presentation, I'd ask you to please wait until the end. Feel free to type it in there, but you might have to just type it again. If you don't want to forget it, you can type it in now. But I might miss it because if there's a lot going on in the chat. So try and hold them at the end. If you don't want to forget it, you can type it in when you have it. So quickly, what makes a pine a pine? This is, it can get a lot more technical than this, but this is enough for today's purposes. So pines are evergreen. So sometimes the opposite of that we would call deciduous. Evergreen meaning that they are always green. So they have green leaves year round. So that's one characteristic. Their leaves are needles. So needles are a type of leaf. And then specifically when we're looking at pines, a major characteristic or feature is that they are kind of bundled together in something we call fascicles, which we will talk about more in a minute. They have what we call resinous wood. So their wood is very, very sappy. That's why they were tapped back in the day for turpentine and things like that. That's one of the reasons we call pines softwood. So they secrete a resin, that's a characteristic. Their reproductive structures are cones, so they are gymnosperms. And I put the definition there just if you needed a little reminder, but basically their seeds are unprotected by an ovary or fruit. And then they are monoecious, having both male and female reproductive organs on the same plant. That is not the case with all species, but it is the case with pines, and we'll talk more about that now. Because this is a pretty cool thing. This is like my little hook for why pines are really, really cool, if you don't think they're cool already. This, my friends, is a male pine cone. I know, I didn't know that there was male and female pine cones till probably longer in my career than I should have known. So this is a male cone. These are the pollen producing organs on the tree. And these contrast with our, oops, sorry, I clicked on the wrong side of the screen. female pine cones, this is probably what we're all familiar with, right? When we think of a pine cone, this is what we're thinking about, and these are actually the female cones. Now, I mentioned before that they exist on the same tree, which you can see here. So over here, we have the male cones, and then we have the female cones here. And typically, this picture doesn't show it well, but over a broad picture of the tree, typically the male cones will be located lower down on the tree than the female cones. And that's just to eliminate possible self-pollination. These are the pollen is carried by wind, so we want to kind of prevent the pollen from dropping down and like self-pollinating their own tree. And so it hopefully will encourage the pollen from the male cones to travel away from the tree to pollinate another tree of the same species. So that's your fun fact for today. I typically tell a joke but I can't really do it without them in hand. It just wouldn't be as good. So if you want to hear the joke, you'll have to join me on one of my future guided hikes at Brooker Creek Preserve, which is where I'm located. So kind of big picture, when we're talking about pine trees, they're in the Pinaceae family, which is called the pine family, but there's more than pines in this family. We're not going to go into all the detail, but when we're talking about kind of looking worldwide, North America, Asia, Europe, there's 10 genera. You might be more familiar with the term genus. 10 genera and 210 species within this family, right? Okay, that's a lot. Then we narrow it down. We're just looking at the southeast. It drops to 6 genera and 16 species, which is still kind of a lot if you're just starting off learning trees. Then when we just get to Florida, it drops to 1 genera and 7 species. So there's only 7 species of true, what we're going to be talking about, pine trees here in Florida. And then here in Pinellas, we only have 3 species. So I figured in honor of Florida Arbor Day, it'd be a great one to start with because I trust that you'll be able to identify these 3 by the end of this and just be more excited about learning to identify more trees going forward. So the 3 species that we are going to explore today, the longleaf pine, slash pine, and sand pine. Now, sand pine is probably one we're less familiar with. Longleaf and slash, these are 2, they look very similar. It is quite hard to tell these apart sometimes. You can see in terms of their height, they can grow to be about the same size. They're about the same diameter, between 1.5 to 2.5 feet in diameter. Now, where they live is kind of where you could learn to differentiate in a more natural setting, landscape settings, right? If we're planting these, it's a little bit harder, but slash pines can tolerate wetter soils a lot better than longleaf pines. So they tend to be in like less well-drained soils near shallow ponds and swamps. Longleaf pines tend to like it a little bit drier. And then when we get to sand pine, if it's not indicated by the name, they have a very limited range because they thrive in basically very nutrient poor soils, very, very deep sandy soils. So very dry. These are smaller trees. They look very different overall in their structure, which we'll look at in a minute. So this one's pretty easy to identify out of the 3, but we'll learn more. So what we're going to look at for these 3 species, we're going to look at the bark, the twigs, needles, cones, and then I mentioned overall structure. So one thing I always like to point out is if you've done any type of botany or you're really looking at plants, one thing that they do not have is bark, and bark is often overlooked. But bark in itself can be an identification characteristic. Like you could look at the bark and be like, that is a blank just by looking at the bark. And this time of year when we don't, sometimes outside of pines, we don't have leaves to look at, right? Bark is a very helpful characteristic to look at, along with other things we won't get into today. But when we're looking at the bark of longleaf pine, again, it's similar to slash pine, but when they are mature, in general, we say like there's little plates always that on the bark. They kind of form these little blocks. But the kind of flakiness on the longleaf pine is more irregular, is really like the only way to describe it. You can see these same plate shapes on the slash pine, but you can see there's not like kind of this irregular flakiness to it. They're very like clean plates. They say the slash pine tends to be more orangey in color, which can be true. Sometimes that is a very clear giveaway, but you can see like in these two images here, like there's both orange to them. It depends on the fire rotation. It depends on all sorts of environmental factors, like how thick that bark gets. If it gets really thick, it tends to get more of like a grayish color. So it's not always helpful. And when they're younger, the bark looks very, very similar. So I would not rely on bark when you're looking at young pine trees. Now, in the case of sand pine, it looks very different than the other two. To me, it's a very it's a much neater looking bark. The blocks tend to be much more like similar to one another. And to me, it tends to be a little bit more of this gray brown. It can vary again, but in my experience, it has more of a gray appearance than the other two species. So that is something to look for, again, in mature sand pine species. Okay, I just taking a quick, are they all upland trees? So for the most part, yes, with the exception of slash pine can grow in uplands, but they can also tolerate wet soils in more like bottomland habitats. It's a good question. And is there a fourth pine in Hillsborough County? I'd have to honestly look at the range. Loblolly pine would probably be the only other one whose range could dip into Hillsborough County, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Okay, so when we look at the twigs, and when I'm talking about the twigs here, really what I want you to focus on is where the needles emerge from the tree. Okay, so this part here, this part here, and this part here. In the case of sand pine, they kind of come out all over the place. But with longleaf and slash pine, again, they can look very, very similar. But one thing we do, and I call this surfs up, is when I'm out on a guided hike, I have everybody hold their hand like this. And I say, okay, look at your pinky. Typically your pinkies are skinnier than your thumb. And then I have them look up at where these needles emerge from the twig. And what you'll see, I typically start off with slash pine. You can see it's a very, very skinny twig. And these are pictures both on mature species. So this is the case regardless of age. It's a much skinnier twig compared to the much thicker twig of the longleaf pine. So it looks more like your thumb on longleaf pine and skinnier like your pinky on the slash pine. In general, and you'll see this as I continue on, everything with longleaf pine is like bigger, fatter, thicker, longer than slash pine. Sand pine, again, is kind of like the outlier with everything. Their twigs are very, very skinny, doesn't really look anything like longleaf or slash pine. The needles kind of come out all along the twig, and tends to be a little bit more red in color compared to the more grayish brown on the other two species. Okay, so now when we get to needles, this is a fun activity if you have kids or grandkids. It's a very simple counting game that you can do. If you don't have access to live branches where you can reach or see the needles, you can always just look down underneath and pick up some needles. And basically you do a little counting game. So when we look at longleaf pine, if the length alone is not a dead giveaway, because sometimes they're super, super long. Like if it's over a foot, it's a longleaf pine. But you can see it can vary anywhere from 10 to 18 inches. But the thing is, they will be, remember I mentioned a characteristic of pines is they're in these like bundles or fascicles of needles. So you can see in this little bundle here, this is a longleaf pine. We have 1, 2, 3 needles. So that is a characteristic of the longleaf pine. Now, occasionally you will find fours. That's kind of like your four-leaf clover. If you do find one with four, that is, I wouldn't say super rare. It's just not very common. It's kind of your fun find of the day. So if you know you're somewhere where there's longleaf pine, that can be another fun activity. See if you can find a set of needles that has four. The other thing to notice with the longleaf pine, because the needles are so long, gravity tends to kind of take hold of those needles. And if you look out at the tips of the branches, they tend to look almost like a ball shape because they're all branching out. It tends to be a denser cluster of needles compared to a slash pine. And so it gives it this kind of ball shape. Again, not always the case. Sorry. Okay. Now, slash pine is the one in the middle here. And you can see I have these two together. So the unique thing with slash pine is their bundles or fascicles of needles can come in twos or threes on the same tree. So typically it'll be more dominated by sets of two, but three will be mixed in there, and it's not rare like the set of four in the longleaf pine. So twos and threes on the slash pine is what you want to look for, a combination of these two. And you can see the length of the needle from 7 to 12 inches. So there's a little bit of overlap with the length on the longleaf pine. So sometimes length alone is not kind of a dead giveaway. Again, if they're super long, yes, but otherwise it can be questionable. So that's when you want to start counting. If you're finding twos, it's for sure not a longleaf pine. So that can be helpful. And then when we get to sand pine, again, very different. The needles themselves are much, much smaller, only 2.5 to 3 inches long. Bundles of two, that's it. All you're going to find is twos. And they tend to be a little bit more like twisty in appearance compared to the more straight needles of the longleaf pine and the slash pine. Okay, and thank you. James did verify that loblolly pine has been vouchered in Hillsborough County. So that would be a 4th species there. Okay, so I'm going to give you a pop quiz based on what you just stored in your very smart brains. Looking at this picture, what type of pine do you think this is? And I'm going to grab a sip of water while you take your best guess. You got, a pretty good odds here. It's only 3 to pick from: slash, loblolly, or sand pine. Okay, I see mostly slashes. Okay, some slash, some long. And then if you're a good typer and you want to say why you chose your answer, what was your key dead giveaway? I'll give a second to type that in. Okay, the fat stem. I see a 2, 2, 2s and 3s. Okay, yeah, so scale here is a little challenging. I can see how, like, from here, yes, that twig does look like it's like the size of your thumb. But yes, I forget who it was now. Santa and Nicole. And I'm not even going to attempt to say your name because I'm going to butcher it. And okay, I'm trying to see if anybody else said the 2s. So that is the dead giveaway down here on the bottom. This one here, if you count 1, 2, and then if you go up to this next fascicle, there's 1, 2, 3. Now, and then if you go like this one here, you can see is 1, 2. It's not easy to really count the other ones. So that right there would pretty much be like, that is a slash pine because there's 2 and 3 on the same tree. Now, something we always say when we're talking about any type of plant identification is you always want to look at more than like one set of leaves. So it could just happen to be that like this one needle fell out of the bundle, right? So you'd want to look at more and just make sure you're not mistaking your count just by some natural error. Okay, so for female cones, again, longleaf pine, everything's bigger, longer. So the mature seed cones of the longleaf pine can get anywhere from 6 to 10 inches. I mean, they can get massive. I should have grabbed one to have next to me. I have some in my office, but they, in terms of their color, tend to be like a very dull brown, which is important to differentiate between the slash pine we'll talk about next. They have a slight prickle to them in terms of like the outer edge. You can kind of see them sticking off here on the edge of the cone. And the cones themselves fall from the tree in the second year. So they'll kind of hang on to them for a little while before they fall from the tree. Slash pine, on the other hand, you can see smaller in size, anywhere from 3 to 7 inches long. So there again, we have a little bit of overlap. But in terms of color, to me, the color, if it's like a fresh cone, if you're finding them on the ground, all bets are off. But they tend to be much more shiny and more of like a beautiful, like rich tan color to me. Similar prickle to them on the edge of the cone. The cones will open September through October, and then they fall from the tree in the same year. So unlike the longleaf that kind of hold on to them. Now with sand pine, again, very, very different, much smaller. Their cones only 2 to 3.5 inches long. They tend to be very, very like short and fat. Again, can vary in color, but when they're on the tree, they're more of like a reddish brown, somewhat similar color to the slash pine. They do tend to be clustered like you see in the image here. The key thing with sand pines is their cones are persistent. So they're going to hang on to the tree pretty much for life. That is just how they are designed. Their cones are considered serotinous, which means that there's a resin that basically holds them shut. And they will only open under extreme heat or fire. And just the structure, which I'll show you of the sand pine in a minute, is designed so that the parent tree that's held onto these cones forever, it retains its lower branches. And so when a fire comes through, those lower branches are designed to serve as what we call a fire ladder. So it literally, like the parent tree sacrifices itself, it will burn up, carries the fire up the tree, but that will open up these cones, allow the seeds to germinate in this now open bare area that the fire has just burned. Now, when we look at the male cones, now I've mentioned everything on longleaf pine is bigger, fatter, longer. In my key resource that I go to for all tree identification, they specify that the male cones of the longleaf pine are 1 to 1.5 inches long, compared to the slash pine that can get up to 2 inches long. In my personal experience and observation, again, the longleaf pine, everything tends to be bigger, fatter, longer. Color can maybe be helpful in identifying these. They do tend to be more of a kind of deep purplish blue color on the longleaf pine. All of them really form in these clusters you can see on your screen. Longleaf pine, these male cones will start to emerge in November. And then, sorry, but if you have allergies, get ready because the pollen is about to start in late February. So I know that's like for my husband, that is like not a happy time for him. Slash pine, similar coloration. They tend to be a little bit more on the brown side. Now, these colors will kind of change as they get ready to release the pollen, which is pretty much yellow for all of them. So they'll all eventually kind of turn a yellowish color when the pollen is being released. For the slash pine, though, they will release similar time frame. The pollen gets shed in January and February. So starting now. And then sand pine, these are like the cutest little male pine cones you could ever imagine. I was just picking some up yesterday for a display that I'm making. So they're only up to like 1/2 inch big, tend to be more on like the yellowish brown color. And then these are visible in the fall, but shed pollen a little bit earlier than the others. So I'm going back in mid-November and December. So I'm finding a lot of these have already done their business. They're fallen underneath the sand pines. In my tree ID book, sorry, I'm looking over at the chat. Can you see it? Whoa. I don't know if you can see that, but it's called Native Trees of the Southeast, and it's by Kirkman, Brown, and Leopold, and I can put that in the chat at the end. So when we talk about overall structure, I think when we think of pine trees, perhaps I'm biased, but kind of what you see here in A with the longleaf pine and here in B is what we typically think of, kind of this bare trunk, and then the branches and twigs are more towards the top half of the tree. But again, with the sand pine, remember I said that they retain those lower branches because they're going to sacrifice themselves in the event of a fire. So you can see that on a sand pine, it kind of has more of a Christmas tree appearance, which is one of the reasons, perhaps some of you guys do this, sand pines are like a native Florida Christmas tree that we can put up during the holidays. So if you've never done that before, you could look into that for next year, but it does tend to have more of a Christmas tree look than the structure of the slash pine and the longleaf pine. So one other thing that you can look for, kind of starting this time of year, going forward a little bit more into the spring, on the longleaf pine, they are known for these, what we often just refer to as candles. These are basically the terminal buds where the tree is going to continue to grow. They are very, very distinct. They're these kind of silvery white, very thick, they just emerge from the end of the twigs. And you can see them from very far away. And that is very helpful for an identification of longleaf pine. The buds of the slash pine are much skinnier and more like green in appearance. They tend to have a little bit more evidence of needles emerging from them than the longleaf pine does here. And sand pine, again, they're so tiny. It's very cute, but looks nothing like this. Now, the other thing with longleaf pine, which once dominated literally like the entire southeast portion of the United States, it was the most dominant tree species that we had. Unfortunately, these trees, I shouldn't say this unfortunately, due to fire suppression and of course development, these trees require fire in order to thrive and survive. And so in the absence of fire, these ecosystems have basically transitioned into being dominated by other tree species. I just briefly want to talk about their really cool fire adaptation. So longleaf pine has something called the grass stage, which you can see here. It looks like a grass. And it stays like this for like 6 to 7 years, which is another reason this tree is not commonly used in like pine plantations, because it takes a really long time for the tree to grow. While it's in this grass stage, it's basically investing all of its energy into developing a very strong root system. They have a taproot. So it's doing that, It's got these very dense needles. And it's designed in this way because if a fire comes through, fire needs 3 things in order to occur: heat, fuel, and oxygen. And once that fire goes by here, that kind of, if you think of that big silver bud that I showed you on the previous image, the needles basically protect, and that's like the life of the tree. The fire will burn the outside edges of the tree, but it will protect the core. So the fire will go past. It might look horrible and dead, but the main lifeblood of the tree is still alive. And just because nature is freaking awesome, I'm going to say it. Something after a fire goes through triggers this tree to do this rocket, just shoot up. We call this the rocket stage. So the longleaf pine will start to grow super, super fast, straight up. And it does this to the point that if a fire was then to come through, because these systems would typically burn every few years, that it would then be high enough off the ground that, again, the bud would be protected from the next round of fires. So really cool fire adaptation. It's one of my favorite trees. Like if you're going to plant a tree for Florida Arbor Day, plant a longleaf pine if it's appropriate for your yard or landscape. I'm just kidding. You can plant whatever you want, but that's if you want to make me happy, that would be great. Okay, so everyone's still with me? I think we're going to move into our activity portion here, and then we will wrap up. All right. So what I'm going to attempt to do is bring over another screen and walk you through a super quick activity that all of you guys can do at home. It's the URL if you want to follow along, if you have multiple screens or want to do it on your phone. If you just go to treebenefits.com, and I will show you. Nope, that's not it. Okay. So this is what will come up on your screen. And basically, you're welcome to read everything on the left-hand side. It just talks about the purpose and goal of this National Tree Benefits Calculator. But basically, this helps us to determine the ecosystem services that this tree provides and puts a dollar value to it. And by ecosystem services, I just mean the benefits that the tree provides. And we'll explore those in a second when we do this. So I'll just do our zip code up here, Tarpon Springs. So you enter your zip code, again, wherever you live. It gives you instructions on what to do. So you enter the species of the tree, and if you don't know what tree you want to do this, like if you are unsure of the species, we are here to help. You're welcome to send a picture, and we can try and help you identify your species. So let's see, we saw a loblolly bay on our hike this morning, so I'll just do that. The tree's diameter. So if you look up at the top here, I don't know how well you guys can see this, but it says how wide for diameter. How wide is your tree at 4.5 feet from the ground? So basically you will measure 4.5 feet off the ground and figure out like where that is on your body. You'll walk up to your tree, and then you can, if you just have like a flexible measuring tape, you can just measure the circumference of the tree, right? And then divide by pi 3.14 to get your diameter. So there's some fun math you can do. That's a standard measurement in the forestry world. We call that diameter at breast height, if you want to get technical. There are specific what they call DBH for diameter at breast height, DBH tapes, which is a measuring tape that basically has already done the calculation for you. So that's what foresters use. They can just go up, they know where 4.5 feet is off the ground, and they just go and measure their trees that way. So I don't know, I'd say it was probably like maybe 16 for the biggest one that we saw. And we were, land use type, we were in a park. And then I hit calculate. And they have tons of different like models and things that are way above my head that goes through to giving us the information that we see here on the screen. But our particular tree provides $50 worth of benefits every year. And it breaks it down into these different tabs at the top. So, and you can see this is like an overall pie chart. So the biggest benefit here for us would be increasing property value to your home. And the next one is stormwater. So let's check that out. So it says your 16-inch loblolly bay will intercept 4,605 gallons of stormwater runoff this year. And then it goes on again to kind of explain what runoff is if you're not familiar, and the value and importance of that service that trees provide just by being trees. So, so property value, energy, right? Trees provide shade, which hopefully if you plant your tree in the right place to cast shade on your home, can reduce your electricity bill, which can also improve air quality. In addition to the tree itself improving air quality, trees do a really good job of intercepting air pollutants and different particles floating around in the air and trapping them on their leaves. And then, of course, we all probably are aware that trees are really good at sequestering carbon and giving us the oxygen in return. And so, right, that's a great benefit, pulling that carbon dioxide out of the air, providing us in turn with oxygen. So again, feel free to explore this a lot more on your own with the trees in your yard. You can read more details here. And one thing that I have done when I've used this calculator for like outreach and education, I'll actually research the particular tree species and see the average lifespan of that tree, and then multiply this dollar value by the life of the tree. And then it kind of really gives you a big picture of the value and importance of just that one tree over its lifetime. So that's a fun activity that you can do at home. And I had done another calculation with longleaf pines, since that's, of course, what we're talking about today. So it was $104 worth of benefits a year. And then if you want, you can even go on and create. So these are the things I was talking about, outreach events. I create these little tags that basically highlight that information. It just draws the public's attention to like, hey, what is that tag? And then they read it and they're like, oh, I didn't know trees did, you know, X, Y, and Z. So you can make your own right at home, or make a fun little walk in your neighborhood or something. You could save up time. There's National Arbor Day in April if you wanted to work up towards that. So there is a fact sheet I can send out to all of you on, kind of walks you through all the steps on how to do that if you're interested. No, you're not going to go to the next slide. You have to play this whole thing. Okay, well, we're going to keep zooming out. There we go. No. Okay, there we go. So I just want to wrap up on like something fun that you could do at home. And hopefully you learned all the tips that you need to know for identifying the 3 pine species that we have here in Pinellas County. And I'll probably do I'll do one quick pop quiz and then we can jump into questions. Which pine species has needles in 3s and occasionally 4? Yes, see? You guys are good. Okay, which one is very small needles and only in 2s? Yes, sand pine. And there's a lot of our county parks actually do have sand pines that you can see right off the trail system. And the one in 2s and 3s. The only one that's left. Awesome. Great job. And now I'm trying to scroll back up. I think I saw a question. Are all 3 local pines vulnerable to borers and other pests? Yes. Yeah, pine beetles, any type of wood borer pines are definitely prone to. And unfortunately for us, actually, one of the things we've noticed with the sand pines, and this is just here in the preserve because we have lots of deer, for whatever reason, the young sand pines are at like the perfect height, or they give off this amazing scent. But the male deer love to rub when they're velvet, when their antlers are in velvet, they love to rub them on the sand pines, and they literally rub them to death. Like we saw significant death of our sand pines from that. So all sorts of things can get our pines. Okay, and now I will take any other questions that you guys have, and I will plan to kind of wrap up officially at 1. So we have like 5 minutes for questions if anybody has them. Oh, and I think I have one more slide. I do. While anybody might be typing a question, I just wanted to mention there's a couple other resources. So if you're more of like you learn by reading, which is not me, but I have written a blog for you that basically summarizes everything I just told you If you just do a quick search for a pine in my neck, I know, hilarious. There's a blog through blogs.ifas.ufl.edu that I wrote that you can reference. Our This or That field guide is available through the IFAS bookstore, and that compares and contrasts various plant and animal species that could be commonly confused. So longleaf and slash pine is featured in that field guide. If you're into podcasts, I do have a podcast. We release episodes monthly. They're pretty short, 15 to 20, 25 minutes. So you can check that out. We'll be releasing another episode next week. And then our YouTube channel, we have tons of resources on our YouTube channel. If you just do a search for Pinellas County Extension YouTube, I have all sorts of stuff. How to identify a tree, way more in depth than today. The benefits of trees, talking about ecosystem services, how to do that DBH measurement I talked about. So be sure to check that out if you want to learn more. They're all on demand.